I'm really excited to introduce two people who used to work just down the hall from me and now are halfway across the county probably, Emma Grieg and Holly Grant. And Emma is the project leader of FeederWatch and has been studying bird behavior and ecology for over a decade, probably even longer. First in Australia on fairy wrens, then in the Sonoran Desert on verdin, and now through the windows of feeder watchers across the country. Some of you are probably on this Zoom. And Holly has gained a passion for wildlife and conservation her whole life, studying birds and butterflies from New York to Minnesota. And now she serves a really important role as project assistant for both Project FeederWatch and Project Nestwatch. And she said she's really excited to be able to help facilitate the same kind of hands-on learning experiences with the participants for these great programs at the lab. So welcome, Holly and Emma. Don't forget to unmute, by the way.
Hello.
Hi, good to see you.
Good to see you too. So to start today, we're going to do a deep dive on FeederWatch and what makes it so interesting and impactful to our understanding of winter feeder birds, and then move on to answering a wide variety of questions submitted by our audience. So I don't know, Emma, if you want to maybe take a crack at the big question: why are we even studying feeder birds, and how did Project FeederWatch kind of come to be?
Well, I think the biggest reason is because birds are really cool. We're all fascinated by them. Understanding what happens to birds helps us understand what's happening to the natural world as a whole. So feeder birds they're just an example of birds. And it's because feeder birds come right to your window and are really easy to observe that Erica Dunn in the 70s had the idea. She's a professor who works at Bird Studies Canada, had the idea to create FeederWatch. She thought, well, heck, we want to monitor birds through time. People are watching them anyway. Why not ask folks to count them in a standardized way and then report their counts to what was at the time the Long Point Bird Observatory. Now it's Bird Studies Canada. So FeederWatch started actually in Canada a long time ago. And then in the 80s, the Lab of Ornithology joined in so that we could collect data on a wider geographic range than just in Canada. And it's been going ever since with the same counting protocol since the mid 80s. So it's really grown into an amazing data set.
I mean, that's really amazing that the same kind of methods have been used for so long. How does that make it even more powerful, I guess? Is there something that having that same methodology in place allows you to do that maybe hasn't been able to be done kind of in other projects like this?
Yeah, if you didn't have the same methodology in place, you wouldn't be able to compare counts through time or through space. So we can compare a bird count that someone made in Florida in 1991 with a bird count that someone made in Alaska in 2020, because both of those people were counting their birds in the same way. At least hopefully. That's what we're always trying to communicate with our FeederWatch program, is how to count in the same way. So it's great. You can look at changes through space and time and all the birds that come to folks' backyards.
That's great. And if you, I don't know which one, maybe Holly, if you want to take a crack at this, you've had people participating in this for 40 plus years on some scale, right? Why do people get involved? And why do you think people should maybe want to participate? And you being on the front lines of interacting with feeder watchers everywhere, what have you heard from them about what they get out of participating in FeederWatch?
Yeah, sure. So one of the most common, I guess, good quotes that we get from folks is telling us that it's something that really brings a bit of joy to their winter. Not everybody gets to go out and enjoy winter sports. They kind of feel like they're hunkered down, not able to go enjoy the outdoors like they are in the summertime. And a lot of people love this joy of seeing these brightly colored birds coming to feeders that are just outside their window. Other folks, they really like to put a meaning to their counts. It's not just looking at your birds. Now it's, you're able to take down notes of who's coming to your feeder and then submitting that to our project. And so being part of this bigger project that the data you're collecting is going to get used in real scientific papers and contribute to those conservation outcomes. So I think people enjoy that. They like putting purpose to just watching their birds.
So when it comes to putting purpose to watching, part of that is how the project works. Part of it has to do with this methodology that you both have talked about. So I don't know if one of you want to just maybe briefly explain to the audience. I'm sure some of you out there are feeder watchers already. Some of you, this might be your first interaction hearing about FeederWatch. And so, it might be interesting to hear just a little bit about this methodology that has continued on for decades, because it really forms the foundation then of more of what we're going to talk about when it comes to discoveries, right? So I don't know, Holly, if you want to keep going.
Yeah, so what participants do when they participate in FeederWatch is they watch their feeders for any amount of time over the course of 2 days. And during that, they're marking down the highest number of each species that comes within their count site, these boundaries that they determine. So the highest number that comes within that count site simultaneously. So it's how many chickadees are at your feeder at one point in time, how many cardinals, that kind of thing. And so in that, counting that way means that we never count the same bird twice. And so having people submit their counts following this methodology for every count for the last 30 some years, it all contributes to a pretty amazing database. We can compare data that someone collected yesterday to data that was collected in 1989. And it can really provide some interesting insights.
And is there anything that FeederWatch, so, you just explained how this works. If somebody wanted to get involved in FeederWatch, what sort of, do they get much guidance in terms of how to participate? If I'm a new birder, maybe I just put up my first feeder, how do I get involved? Maybe not only the nuts and bolts and where do I sign up, but like how can I become a really good feeder watcher?
Yeah, so you sign up on our website. We do take orders in the mail and over the phone as well, but the website is by far the easiest way to sign up. And then all you need to participate is an area that attracts birds. So it doesn't even need feeders. We've got a lot of people have feeders. Others have bird baths. Others have plantings, berry producing bushes and shrubs. Any combination of the three. Basically, if you have an area that attracts birds, even if it doesn't attract birds, it's still valuable data to us, because even knowing where the birds aren't is just as important as knowing where they are for telling us about where those populations are headed. But yeah, pretty much anybody can participate in FeederWatch. It's fairly easy in that regard.
Sorry, keep going. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah, sorry. I meant to finish too that when you do sign up, we do send you a participant kit. It comes with instructions, a little sample tally sheet, an ID poster. So you can hang that poster up right next to your count site. And it's got the most common feeder birds that will come to your region of the US. We have an eastern and a western side there. So even if you're a little bit worried, you're not really sure if you're going to be able to identify the birds correctly, we've got a ton of resources, especially on our website to help you do that.
That's great. So it's essentially like a one-stop shop for getting rolling, even with identification. And I actually love that poster, by the way. The poster is beautiful. I have one up in my office, back in my actual office. So now that we kind of have a sense of how someone gets their data to Project FeederWatch, I wonder, Emma, if you might be able to touch on what that submission of data, maybe both give us an idea of, for those of us who don't know that much about FeederWatch, what kind of scale are we talking about this data? Where's it coming from? How much data maybe? And then what have you been able to do with those data that couldn't be done without setting up a project like this?
Yeah, no problem. So the scale, project runs throughout Canada and the US. So that's the geographic scope of the thing. And there are a bit over 20,000 people a year now who are submitting counts. And this past, not the current season, but the one before, I think people submitted something like 180,000 checklists. Now, on every checklist, there's a whole bunch of different birds. It was, I think, something like 7 million birds that people observed and counted and told us about just last FeederWatch season. So this is a lot of information coming in. And it's coming in about all the bird species that you might notice in your backyard. Some of them are feeder birds like cardinals, jays. But some of them are not feeder birds. You know, people notice warblers and wrens. Well, heck, wrens sometimes are feeder birds, aren't they? But anyway, so that gives you an idea of the scope of the data set. Now, the types of questions you can answer with that, you might think, well, it's just bird counts. So there's only so you can look at. Does the population go up or does it go down? But actually, folks have done all kinds, not just us at the lab, but other researchers have done all kinds of different research projects with this. So maybe you take those bird counts and you look at how they relate to an invasive bird species spreading across the US, like Eurasian collared doves. So then you learn something about invasive species dynamics. Or maybe you take those counts and you associate them with house finch eye disease, which feeder watchers also collect data about. So then you start to learn about the disease dynamics and the evolution of a disease. So there's all sorts of stuff that you can do with these counts. And I have a little example. This is a good time to share my screen.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. Yeah, let's check it out. And we did get, there's been several questions actually already about when does FeederWatch happen, and do I count hummingbirds? And
good question.
Am I only counting once? How many times am I counting? So maybe before we jump in, just so that people have a sense of when these things are coming from, I don't know if either of you want to take those three questions. When is the season? How often am I counting again? Because I know you mentioned Holly. And do I count hummingbirds, which has come up actually twice, I think, already in questions.
Well, good questions. Do you want to do these, Holly, and then I'll tell the story?
Yeah,
okay.
Sure, yeah. So FeederWatch happens from every November through April. It's about 21 weeks long. And we ask participants to count every week, basically. So the 2-day count should occur at least 5 days apart from the next 2-day count. This is not required though. So even if you submitted just one count all season, it's still valuable to us. But the more data you submit, obviously the better. But again, it's 21 weeks, 21 counts at the very most. And you can count however long you like during the day as well. So maybe you can only count for 10 minutes after work. Maybe you're counting on and off as you do chores. Maybe you count, you sit there and you watch for 8 hours. Any of those options is valid and valuable to us because we ask you to report how long you're watching so we can account for that when we're comparing your data to other people.
And do you count hummingbirds?
Oh yes, and we count any bird that comes within your count site. So you're not going to want to count birds that just fly over it, but anything that's attracted to those things you're providing, you're counting.
And you said feeders aren't necessarily required, right? So we're also talking about you could be landscaping your backyard, right? And we have some questions that came in that we'll get to in a little bit about habitat and good spots for feeders. But thank you for doing that overview, because I just wanted to nip some of these questions in the bud so that people weren't frustrated. And Emma, I don't know if you want to take the reins back over and share what you were going to share.
Yeah, I'm going to try and share my screen, and you'll see why I was chuckling at the question of do you count hummingbirds, because that is exactly what my little story is about, to give you an example of the sorts of things that we can learn just from counts in your yard. Just not, how many, it's so simple. And then the point I also want to emphasize that Holly mentioned is you count multiple times. Doesn't have to be every week, but counting from the same place multiple times ends up being super valuable. And that is, you'll see from this story. So the picture here is, gosh, I wish I could quiz everybody to ask if anyone knows. I can? Well, put in the chat what kind of hummingbird this is, sitting on a snowy branch. It's on snow. This is a hummingbird. That's crazy. I can't see the chat, but is anyone typing a hummingbird?
Rufus, Anna's, lots of Anna's coming in.
They know. It's Anna's hummingbird. That's right. So this hummingbird lives in the Pacific Northwest and, well, here, I'm just gonna put their darn range up. They're on the West Coast, basically. Let me switch. Here we go. So what this map is showing you is part of their range. They also go further south into Arizona. And what we could tell from looking at just FeederWatch counts over the years, you'll notice this map animation starts in 1990, is that these hummingbirds were becoming more and more common during the winter FeederWatch season. So they were they're basically expanding their winter range north over the past several decades. So the map is just a loop showing you that expansion where the gray, there's no hummingbird, and the pink, there are hummingbirds. And now this, I might just point out, shows you right here and now how useful it is to have data on where birds are not. If we didn't have that, we wouldn't be able to do any of this hummingbird research. So the counts with nothing for a species are just as useful as counts with them. All right, now it's a lot here, but I don't think it's too much. So I'm gonna try and explain it. What this graph shows you, it uses a statistical method called occupancy modeling. And the FeederWatch counts are perfect for this because it's repeated counts through time from the same place. So that makes them perfect for occupancy modeling. What occupancy modeling tells us is the likelihood that given a certain set of circumstances, you're gonna have that bird at that place. So let's see. Now, can you see my mouse moving around on my screen? Oh, that is great. So each one of these lines on this graph that I'm going down, they go from dark to pale, and that is going through time. So the darkest line is the earliest one from 1996, and the palest is the more recent, which was from 2013. And we have even more recent now. And what it shows you is the likelihood that if you're a feeder watcher, you're gonna have an Anna's hummingbird at your count site, depending upon your latitude. Well, if you live in the South, if you're in California, Arizona, it doesn't matter what year you're in, you're very likely to have an Anna's hummingbird. That's what all these lines over here is telling us. In the 1990s, if you lived in the Pacific Northwest, you were very unlikely to have a hummingbird. But as time went on, 96, 1999, 2001, 7, 13, you see, as time goes on, you're more likely to have an Anna's hummingbird in the north, if you live in the north. So that's showing us, just with these counts, that the range of these birds is changing. Okay, now I got an arrow here to show you get it, right? So through time, it became more common, but then the arrow is to say that even though they've become more common in the north, overall, there's still a trend where as you move north on the West Coast, you're a bit less likely to have an Anna's hummingbird than if you are in the South. Okay, you got that? Yes, yeah. Let's say yes. Well, here, the next slide, this is the amazing part that is why these repeated observations are so cool. It looks really simple, but I'm telling you, it's amazing. This one line with some error bars going up is so cool because it is I know it sounds boring, detection probability. It sounds like just some computer made this thing up. But what it is it's telling us, given that you have an Anna's hummingbird in your yard, which you know because you've seen one once since you've counted, how likely are you to see it on any given count day? So when you look out and do your FeederWatch count, do you see an Anna's hummingbird every single time you look out there? Or maybe just once in a while there happens to be an Anna's? Well, look at this. Now remember, we just learned as you move north, you're less likely to have bananas at all. But as you move north, if you have one, you're more likely to see it. Now, what on earth does that mean? Can I quiz people again? I wish I could see the chat. Why would you see them more often if you're in the north, even though you're less likely to have one in your yard? Will you tell me a couple answers coming in?
Yeah, we get dependent on the feeder. It's because I have feeders out in southern Vancouver. More likely to see in winter with leaves down. They specialize on feeders because of the feeder.
Hey,
fewer hummingbirds.
I like it.
Yeah.
Yeah, y'all are getting the idea very well. These birds are coming to darn bird feeders. So the birds in the colder places come to the feeders more often. Well, the last little tidbit here is to show how we can learn more about birds, more than just about birds, however you say that, from looking at FeederWatch data. So one of the things people do when they FeederWatch is they describe their count sites and they tell us what kinds of things they offer. So we know what proportion of folks in these different areas are putting out hummingbird feeders. And what you can see from this graph, I think I got an arrow here. Oh, whoops. Wow, that's the wrong arrow. Okay, so the gray line on the top is in the more southern area, the historical range of these hummingbirds. And it's pretty consistent in how likely it is someone has put out a hummingbird feeder. But in the range expansion, this is people changing their behavior, not birds. Over time, people are more likely to put out a hummingbird feeder if you live up in the Pacific Northwest or British Columbia than they used to. So there's actually an interaction happening here between hummingbirds and people. And we can see it from just bird counts. That's all it is. Well, and site descriptions. So that's the take home message to me, is that just from these simple numbers, we can learn about these cool interactions between birds and people. And I think that part of it is, it's like, we know this. We know, of course, there's an interaction between whether I put out a hummingbird feeder and whether a hummingbird shows up in my yard. But we can show it with these FeederWatch data. So I think this is one of my favorite stories because it just highlights what you can do. It's just one example of what you can do with repeated bird counts from the same location through time. Now, let's see if I can unshare. Stop. There we go.
That was really incredible. And what a beautiful set of birds. Sort of jumping off that sort of rarity, we had a couple questions like, even if it's a rare bird, am I supposed to count it? That was one that came through. And it sounds like that's the way you discover these interactions, right? In a way, these range expansions. It's a bird that wasn't that common. And then there was a couple of questions about
one about hawks too, and I wanted to
say hawks and owls. Yeah. So do you want to take that?
Yeah. So like when I said, when birds are attracted to the yard because of something you provide, birds at feeders can be something that you provide. So even predators are eligible for FeederWatch checklists.
It's sort of a meta bird feeder in that case. Right. And that is one of the realities, right, of running a bird feeder, is that some things that like to eat birds are also attracted to it, because it then becomes a bird feeder, I suppose. So a couple other FeederWatch questions, just because I don't know if there's a lot of feeder watchers in here, or a lot of people thinking about FeederWatch, or just really excited about the methodology. So I think it's actually fun to deal with some of these. Well, very quickly, can you still sign up now?
Absolutely.
That was one question, because the season's already started, right?
You can sign up all year round. I think this turnover is somewhere in February, March, but even so, sign up all year round, and you're ready to go almost immediately. Awesome. I believe too. If you're online, you can get access to data entry within the hour. So
right, that's awesome. Another question about counting birds: can you count the birds you hear?
That's not what we want people to do. It's really exciting to hear birds. I know we've had some people that really want to count owls that they hear after dark. So even though they are very cool, we want to make sure that you're only counting birds that you see come within your count site. Plus, it's really hard to count birds when you hear them. The ones you're hearing might be a bunch of them going, and when you hear a bunch of them going, how do you determine exactly how many birds that is? And again, like we were saying, as long as everybody's counting the same way, that's how we want people to be able to participate, is counting the same way as other participants. And if not everybody can hear the birds in the same way, or they can't count the same way, that's just gonna throw some bias into the data.
So an interesting question to follow that up about counting the same way. Why are you only interested in birds during the winter? Why aren't we counting in the summer? Why aren't we counting all the time? What's the deal? Wouldn't it be interesting too? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Oh, lots of thoughts. We talk about this all the time. Now, remember, I told you all that FeederWatch started in the 70s and then joined Cornell in the 80s. Well, back then, everyone submit their data on pieces of paper, and those pieces of paper had to get scanned. I mean, whoosh, it was a lot of work to process all the data. So part of why FeederWatch was not year-round was just because you had to take a break to process all of these forms. The other reason was it started because when it's cold, that's when a lot of folks feed birds more often. The bears are hibernating, the birds can use the food a little more because cold snaps, it's more useful to them. So it's for historical reasons, is my point here, that FeederWatch is only in the winter. We would love to have it year round, but we're not quite ready to expand it because there's a lot that has to be done in order to do that. So maybe down the road, we'll be able to create the infrastructure to have it be year round. I would love it, just not quite there yet. I'm glad to hear questions about that because it tells me that folks might like to do it.
Well, and we even have someone chomping at the bit just to make sure. Someone wrote in the chat, this is my first year counting. Will I automatically be signed up for next year, or do I have to remember to sign up again? And my guess is they don't probably have to remember because you'll remind them, but what's your answer for that one?
Yeah, so we send out renewals in the springtime. So we send out a little reminder to let you know you can sign up again. Like I said, the turnover is somewhere in March and April. We usually have some sort of deal that lets you get the next season as well. But yes, you do have to sign up every year. And just to put it out there, like I said, we do ship those kits to people for their first year. In subsequent years, we do ship out renewal kits as well. So it's usually smaller and just kind of a little reminder that, hey, the FeederWatch season's starting soon. And if you do sign up for the next year, just don't expect to get that renewal kit until the fall. So we try to send it out just before the season rather than immediately if you do renew early.
And can you remind people how they can sign up?
Yep, so that's at feederwatch.org. You'll see a bright red button that says join, renew, or donate. So you can click on that and then you'll have the option to either sign up through the USA, that's us here at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, or through Canada, which is through Birds Canada. So you'll have the option to choose which flag and then it goes right to the correct payment portal.
And you had mentioned if people, so there are people on this webinar that already are feeder watchers, and there are people that aren't, that are getting interested, judging by the chat and the questions. What is the total number again, roughly this year, of people who are feeder watching, just so people get a sense of what they're a part of and also what they'd be joining?
I think it's almost 24,000 people right now across US and Canada. Well, no, that's just US, I think. So Canada's got another couple thousand probably.
Wow.
What?
That's incredible. That's great. So this is a great sort of splitting point. I feel like we did a nice deep dive on FeederWatch. Emma, I wanted to double check. Was there anything else you wanted to share from a top level, kind of what we've learned using FeederWatch? You want to stick to that one story? You want to add another one? Let's
stick to that one.
Perfect,
I mean, I can tell we'll have stories, but if we want to.
That's great. Well, we get a lot of questions, and I'm going to sort of group them thematically. Feel free to keep asking in the Q&A, folks. But a real top level one that came in via email, not email, but via the registration, that I think is an important one for people to, I guess, get your perspectives on. is it good for birds to be feeding them? And people wonder about like, what happens if I stop feeding them? How, can I do it wrong? Is this hurting the birds? And so I wondered if we could just start out this question, because there were a few questions that came in like that. And it's an important one for people, when you're encouraging them to go out and feed birds, is there anything we know about how our bird feeding might affect birds? And is that generally a positive relationship?
Yeah, this is a really good question. And it's also a very nuanced question. There isn't really one answer, which you can imagine makes sense. There are a lot of different kinds of birds and a lot of different locations that birds are taking food. So the pros and cons to feeding are changed depending upon what the birds are, what the predators are in the area, what kind of a feeding setup you have. I would say that one way to think about it, that there's a book called The Birds at My Table by Daryl Jones. And a way that he talked about feeding birds responsibly was to say, imagine you're inviting people to your home for dinner. Well, you would not give them dirty plates and unhealthy food and a scary atmosphere. You would want to give them healthy, fresh food on clean plates in a nice ambiance that's peaceful. So think about that for the birds too. If you provide those things, then you're offering them a nice little snack. Now, there's another part of that question, which is, do birds become dependent on bird feeders? Well, as far as we know, most of the time, birds have a lot of different food sources they're going to. So you may think they're not visiting anyone else, but they probably are. And for goodness sake, these birds were alive for a long time before we were feeding them. So if their strategy in life was to find one food source and never leave it, they might not be around anymore, because in nature, food sources are very ephemeral. It can be. So most birds are traveling around, getting a lot of different food sources. So it's okay to stop feeding them. They actually aren't dependent. That said, the time when we know that feeding birds is the most beneficial to them and actually can increase their survival is when it's really cold out. So if you live in a northern location, there's a cold snap or a big snowfall, all the food is covered, the temperatures are lower, the birds may not have all of their normal food sources, and they may need food more than ever because they're really cold. This is when we find that places with bird feeders tend to have higher survival rates of some species. It's when these cold snaps. So in that particular context, you might say, well, there are contexts in which some species at some times are dependent on those feeders for survival. Most of the time, that's not the case. But so you see how it's but it is hard to generalize about this because it really depends on the place and the species and how you're feeding. And on the whole, if I had to say one thing, it's pretty good for them.
Well, and you bring up an important point that is actually another question that we got probably 5 or 6 times, and it relates to cleaning. How do I clean my feeders? How often do we clean our feeders? And not that you need to like go into the recipe for everything on how to do it, but I don't know if number one, we could just like give them an idea of what it takes to clean feeders and how often they should be doing it, and we could maybe point them to where they could read more about it if they need all the details too. Holly, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. So this is another one of the great resources you can find on our website. We've got a page about sick birds and bird diseases. But generally, we recommend that you clean your feeders about once every week or two, which seems really frequent, but according to some of the studies that we've seen come out, it seems to be that's a good interval. A lot of just like what you were saying, providing clean food. When you clean those feeders, you're going to want to empty them. So if you're worried if the birds aren't eating as fast, I would try filling the feeders maybe only halfway or just a little bit, just to make sure that all of that seed is gone. You don't have to waste so much of it. I know there's some folks that, they refill them and then it's cleaning day the next day. So that can be kind of sad to lose that much seed. But in general, yeah, clean them. Make sure you scrub all of the gross little bits of old food off, and I think we suggest soaking in a very weak bleach solution just to kind of help sanitize it, make sure it's dried completely, and then you can refill it and stick it right back out there.
That's great. And you mentioned something I think it might be worth showing folks who aren't necessarily aware of it. And you mentioned that your website is an incredible resource for both for feeder watchers, people curious about FeederWatch, people interested in learning more about birds, and probably the single biggest set of questions that we got, probably 20 out of 150 or so, involved what kind of feeder should I get if I want to attract blue jays? What kind of suet, like, is there a particular kind of feeder if I want to get a woodpecker to come? What's the difference between, should I put out this kind of seed or this other kind of seed? And so I don't know if maybe we could take a quick tour, high level tour of both where somebody might want to join, because we've had a bunch of questions about how much it costs that I just answered in the Q&A using typing, but they can also maybe see where the buttons are. And then maybe if you wouldn't mind showing them that cool tool that FeederWatch has, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got a couple of pages I can show you then. So let me share my screen. Okay, can you guys see?
Yeah.
All right, so this is the FeederWatch homepage. It's feederwatch.org. And just like I said, there's this nice big red button here that says join, renew, or donate. It's also in the top right. You'll always see this button when you come to the homepage. If you click on that, that will bring you to that page I was talking about. You choose join or renew under the country that you reside in. And that'll bring you right to the payment page. So I just want to start off with that just so people are aware. And I think you said you answered in the chat, but FeederWatch participation is $18 per year. If you're already a member of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, we do give you a discount for $15 a year. So fairly modest there, and that goes to supporting the project and a lot of the behind the scenes stuff that we do to help make this possible. All right, so to those questions about feeders and food and birds, most of our resources are going to be under this Learn tab. So if you can see here, I've got a whole bunch of different options. And the first one I'm going to bring you to is our Common Feeder Birds Interactive. So that's this nice teal page. We're going to go in there. And when you first open it up, you see a huge list of birds. This is all the birds that are common to feeders across the continent, at least US and Canada. And so on the left here, you've got some options for filtering. So in the winter, where are you located? Well, for us, we're in the Northeast. So you can see this already knocks down a lot of species that that live elsewhere. And then food type. Let's say you want to set up your feeder area and you want to provide black oil sunflower seeds. So that knocks out a few more species that don't actually eat sunflower seeds. And then here, I'm gonna move my computer a little bit. Let's say you want to provide those sunflower seeds in a large hopper feeder. So that whittles the list down even more. And it says, okay, so this is what your setup looks like. These are the birds that are most likely to come to your feeders. It's by no means a complete list, but the ones you're most likely to see. The other way you can use this, I'm going to reset all of these, is you can say, you know what? I really want to see a northern cardinal at my feeders. How can I do that? So if you come down here, you can click on that bird species, and then it brings you all of those preferences right to the front of your screen. So northern cardinals, they come pretty much all over the US and Canada, most areas. And if you want to attract them, you can provide sunflower seeds, safflower, cracked corn, peanut hearts, millet, and milo. Those are the foods that we find that they're most attracted to. And again, with the feeder types, they'll come to large tube feeders, large hoppers, platform feeders, and even if you sprinkle that food on the ground. So it's a pretty interesting tool. Now,
I love that tool. It's just so intuitive, and it's got cool art, and you get to look at cool pictures of birds too.
Absolutely. One of my favorites is looking at the Baltimore Oriole here. Some people don't notice, they know that they'll come to fruit, right? You can put out orange slices and grape jelly to attract Baltimore Orioles, but they'll also sometimes drink from hummingbird feeders, and they'll sometimes even eat suet. So it's a really cool way to learn about the foods that some of these birds eat that you might not have thought of before.
And I mean, just I'll throw this out there. Holiday season is coming up for lots of people who celebrate holidays this time of year. And if you're wondering about that next feeder or your first feeder. There's no shopping links here, but this will put you on the right path towards hopefully getting a feeder that'll lead you to the birds, or for your, a sibling or a parent or something.
Absolutely. And I just want to share one more thing here. So on that Learn tab again, just above our interactive tool is this link to feeding birds. And this, I think, is going to be the most applicable to anybody who's feeding birds, whether they're a feeder watcher or not. This is where we kind of go into detail about what each of these feeders are, a little bit more description, and then the food types as well. So we kind of talk a little bit more about how sunflower seeds can be a good source of energy. You scroll down to mealworms, peanut hearts. There's just a lot of good information here. And as you scroll down the page, we've got information about offering water to birds. Farther down, providing a safe feeding environment. And as you go down, there's deterring unwelcome birds, other feeder visitors like squirrels, a lot of really good information on this page. So again, that's under the Learn tab, and it's the Feeding Birds page. Is there anything else you'd like me to show on the website while we're here?
I think that might be good for now. Yeah, if you want to pop out of your screen share. Yeah, I think we'll see if because there's a few different questions that, because the tool is built around general, if you, there's a few different things about questions about both, like if you're only going to put out one food, or what's the most economical food, or is there one food that'll attract the most diverse set of birds that come, so, lots of people don't maybe have access to lots of different kinds of foods even. So if you had to give a piece of advice to people, if they can only put out one thing, or they can only put out one feeder, which they put in there, is there sort of a catch-all food that is at least a good start until they sort of break down and figure out a way to get more feeders up?
Yeah, I would go with sunflower seeds. It's a native plant to the US. A lot of birds like to eat it. Almost all the birds on that list do. Either it's shelled or unshelled. I think the hulled sunflower seeds might be a little bit more expensive, but usually a local feed store or garden store will have sunflower seeds for sale. But they provide really good energy, just like peanuts, suet, and thistle as well. So any of those choices, I think, are my favorites to offer to my birds.
And then when it comes to suet, we had a number of people asking questions about suet, and a couple of them, is there what should my suet be made out of? That's the best, whatever that might mean. How can I potentially keep other undesirable things from eating my suet, like everything from black bears to raccoons to the obvious squirrel. And I know that you just listed that there's a bunch of information on your sort of FAQ page for feeders, but is there any sort of higher level kind of advice you could give people about that want to feed suet, but really only want to attract woodpeckers probably?
Probably some of the best energy rich suet is going to be made of rendered fat, beef fat. I think on our page there, we say rendered beef kidney fat or something like that. But that animal fat is usually a pretty good source of energy. I know some people make it with corn syrup, and I don't know the effects of that, whether that's necessarily good or bad, but I tend to go towards the fattier suets. And to help keep undesirable birds away from it, sometimes people don't want to have house sparrows on their feeders. I think we've found that if you hang the suet feeder on its side and have it only accessible from the bottom, that sometimes keeps house sparrows and starlings away because they can't cling to the bottom like your chickadees and woodpeckers can. And for bears, it's just better to keep your feeders inside, really. You don't want to attract them.
That is, yeah, they'll take down the entire feeding setup. I saw a friend of mine had his pole literally bent to the ground by a black bear. So the best thing to do is put the feeders away when there are bears out, is what I've learned anyway from that person.
Yeah, I just saw something come through. Someone said bacon fat. I would probably be careful about providing raw fats. The rendered fat part, I think, is what helps it. Sorry, not the rendered, but the raw fat might spoil faster, especially if it's in a warm environment. So you just want to be really careful if you're providing suets that haven't been processed in a special way.
That makes sense. There were a couple of specific things that probably wouldn't, again, be surfaced in your FAQ page from people wondering about balconies, urban environments, attracting pests from fallen seed, and whether you guys had any advice to people trying to watch feeders, wanting to watch feeders, but doing it in potentially more difficult environments like that, where they don't have as much space potentially.
You want to take this one, Emma?
Yeah, it can be tricky to feed birds in urban locations where there's more likely to be rodents around, but you know, you just have to think of ways that you can be tidy. Holly mentioned that some seeds, you can buy hulled sunflower seeds. Sometimes if you get stuff that's already got the hulls off, it's a little tidier as well. But you know, you can also go out with your broom and clean up stuff that's fallen. So that's really the best I can suggest if you're in a place where there's a risk of attracting rodents.
Yeah, it's always a challenge. There's the daytime rodents, like the squirrels, and then there's the nighttime rodents, which are even less desirable. So there were a few, I think they're interesting questions about bird feeding, because they're things that anyone who's had or watched a bird feeder, if you've watched any of our bird feeding cams online, sometimes there are birds there and sometimes they're not. Or, for example, a couple people just wrote in, gosh, you know, a month ago, 6 weeks ago, the blue jays and the chickadees were hammering my feeders. And like, now they're not even there that much. Like, what am I doing wrong? I'm putting out the same food. I don't know if Emma or Holly, if you want to touch on maybe biologically, what might be leading to these patterns. And my guess is people are noticing them a lot more now because they're at home and they're actually even more attuned to the fact they want to look at birds out their windows. Like, where did they go? I put this food out, right? I'm here during a pandemic. So what might describe some of these reasons why they're seeing birds and then they're not, you know, weeks later, like just not a rate of visitation, or, you know, even throughout a given day?
Well, I would say, as we talked about before, right, with a lot of, if you live in an area that just got a big snowstorm, it's covering up a lot of natural food sources, you're probably going to see more birds at your feeder than a day where there is no snow. And you also have to think about when natural food sources are ripe in nature, if that's the right word. You know, when are those plants fruiting or producing seed? You know, I know a lot of folks have said, oh, I had all these birds in the summer and then they didn't come to my feeders all fall. Well, fall is a really good time for plants to be producing their own food. So a lot of people don't get as many birds during that time because the birds are all off getting food from nature. I don't know if you have anything to add, Emma.
Yeah, those were some of the points that I was going to make. And also, I guess this kind of highlights what we were talking about earlier about birds not getting dependent on your feeders. Even when the food is out there, they're not always showing up because they've got other food sources that they're using. So yeah, it's different species have different movement patterns locally, and that's what you can see by watching birds carefully. But don't worry,
one thing,
I'm not bad. Sorry.
Right. No, I was gonna say, one thing that I've noticed that somebody else brought up in the questions is that birds were taking away a lot of food earlier and seem to be doing less of that now. And I don't know if you guys have any information to share about what birds are doing with those seeds when they leave with them, when they don't eat, when they're not consuming the seeds. Does that make sense?
It sure does. I've even watched blue jays take us some seeds and then go to the patio and then meticulously bury the seeds and bring little vegetation pieces and cover their seed pile because they're going to come back for that later. Yeah, right. They're caching. That's what's happening when birds are, most of the time when birds are taking seeds away, like when blue jays stuff their gullets and then fly off. Now, some birds, like nuthatches and chickadees and such, you'll see them take one seed and then they fly off, and you might be able to watch them eat it. They sit and they peck the seed and eat it right there, but they don't do it at the feeder. Whereas a dove will just sit at the feeder and eat, and every seed is just swallowing it whole. They don't even take the shells off of seeds. Doves are so lazy. I love them, so I can say that about doves. So anyway, you're seeing caching behavior or just differences in kind of foraging behavior of different species.
That's really neat. And it's a neat thing to be able to see. You know, the more you watch your feeders, the more little things you'll notice like that. That's definitely something I've noticed. So we're 52 minutes into a 60-minute long webinar right now. And there's a couple things that I think we still should try and get to if you guys are game for it.
Yeah, let's
one
do
of them,
questions.
Yeah. So one of them was literally, what birds do you especially like watching, and why? When it comes to watching birds, I'm guessing they meant around feeders, but they didn't say that. So if you want to expand it beyond feeders, I would say go for it. I just think since we've been talking all about birds, and there were a couple of questions just about what's driving kind of, I think trying to learn a little bit more about your interest in birds, that'd be a fun question to answer before the end.
Okay, yeah. You want to go first, Holly?
Sure. Yeah, so I'll answer both then. I'll say birds at my feeders first. I really love my little Carolina wren that comes. I know we're on the very northern part of their range, so I feel kind of special to have two of them that'll come every once in a while. They're just such a pretty chestnut brown. You know, you get a lot of birds that aren't that warm color in the winter. It's kind of a nice thing to see at the feeders.
Yes.
Like in general too, one of my favorite things is going out in May and looking at all the warblers. I mean, it's just wonderful to go out for a walk and just have the trees dripping with all these beautifully colored birds. I mean, maybe it's a little biased from doing field work in Minnesota on warblers, but I really do enjoy that. It's probably every weekend in May, I'm out in the woods looking for them.
That is, yeah, dude, the chestnut, the beautiful warmth of a wren, Carolina wren in the wintertime when they're surrounded by black and white and gray.
Right.
High on my list too, very much. How about you, Emma?
Well, all I can think about are these red poles that I saw yesterday. I was so excited. I can't believe those little things live in the snow-covered boreal forest. It's just amazing, just like that hummingbird. I think I'm really fascinated by birds that can deal with extreme weather, like red poles or verdin. If you live in the Southwest, you know what a verdin is. They're a little desert bird and live in extreme heat. I just can't believe it. They're so little.
Yeah. I mean, every time I see a chickadee in the winter or a kinglet and it's, 15 degrees and I'm bundled up to to my nose and they're just living life. It is amazing what they can keep up with when it comes to weather. So we have 5 minutes, and I think a good kind of closing question for you guys and for our audience to really ponder for themselves is, I think we're all here because we love birds. Everybody out there who's a feeder watcher, gosh, thank you so much for spending your time sharing your backyard with us, just like our feeder watch cam up in Ontario. If you guys ever want to check that out, if you haven't, that's a feeder watcher. That's the only reason we even know about Tammy's backyard, and she gives every year. And if you want to see red poles, you don't have them where you live, you can watch that camera long enough, you'll see some. But I think we all care about birds and we want them to be there. We want them to be there 5 years from now and 100 years from now. So is there anything, obviously, besides joining FeederWatch that people could be thinking about, or that is important that people can do to help make sure that birds are around? That and obviously joining FeederWatch, great first step. But
it's the main
in
thing.
in addition to sharing their data, what would be a top level thing that you would encourage people to do?
Gosh, recycle, don't use pesticides, think about the habitat in your yard. Like, what can you as an individual do to lower your carbon footprint? These are the sorts of things that are affecting not just birds, but all the natural creatures and plants. So I guess that's kind of where I tend to think, or that's where I lead. I don't know, Holly, what is your thing that you think about first?
I think a lot about, not everybody has a big backyard, but there are even little things you can do to help make the area that you have control over more wildlife friendly. Plant native native plants. Make sure you've, like Emma was saying there, you know, avoid pesticides and herbicides. You know, herbicides are meant for plants, right? But they affect more than just plants sometimes. So, you know, just being conscious of those kind of things and what kind of habitat you're providing for the birds can go a long way.
Yeah, leave your yard messy. That's something that I like to say. The leaves
really
under your
embrace.
tree. Yeah, some brush piles, the more bugs and seeds. Hey, you don't feel like mowing your lawn? Great. Let that grass go to seed because that's food for bugs and birds. It's insects. What?
Insects. I was gonna say insects is such a huge one. I mean, people, you know, that's why people have insecticides. They use the sprays and everything. But I mean, that's pretty much 99 to 100% of what these songbirds are feeding their young in spring. So the more you can support those insect communities, the more you're going to be supporting birds as well.
Yeah.
Well, we're getting a lot of people chiming in from the chat as well. Get kids involved. Yeah. Indoor cats only. I love cats. Keep your cats inside, which is a really important part of not having dead birds. Plant native. Don't trim your perennials back until spring. I believe in weeds and not raking. So I think you're finding a lot of people are in that lineup, and there's probably a lot of information still on the FeederWatch site about how people can go about making some of these changes, right? Native plants and other things like that, right?
Yeah, I think we have a little landscaping for birds section. I believe it's at the bottom of that feeding birds page that I shared with information on the feeder types and food types.
That's great. Well, so the website again is?
FeederWatch.org.
That's great. And there's still plenty of time to sign up. There's plenty of time to watch birds on our feeder cams, but also in your backyard. Whether or not you have a feeder, you can join FeederWatch and share what you're seeing. And I hope you'll join me with giving a nice round of applause for our guests today. It's really fun to try and share the expertise that's here at the lab with the audience that we know is out there. And one thing that the pandemic has really pushed us to do is to try and open more of those conduits so that information flows between the great information held at the lab and this hungry audience that is evidenced by 600 something registrations and hundreds of questions at this point. So thank you, Holly. Thank you, Emma, for spending this hour with us. Thank you, audience, for spending the time and being really engaged this whole time. We had a lot of questions about, will this be available afterwards? Yes, we'll be posting a recording. And we will do our best to make sure you find out that the recording is posted. Any final parting words from Emma or Holly?
Just say thanks, Charles, for having us. And for anybody who wants to keep up to date with FeederWatch things and isn't sure if they want to participate yet, we have a Facebook page, we have a Twitter. I post there every weekday. And we also have a newsletter that you can sign up for at the bottom of our homepage.
Yeah, and my parting word is to thank all the folks who do participate in FeederWatch. The program wouldn't exist were it not for all you folks submitting data and supporting it financially year after year. So I just think it's amazing what y'all have created.
Awesome. And big thanks to Ben Walters, who's a part of the BirdCams team, who's working behind the scene. There's a long live tweeted episode that's gone out under the Twitter FeederWatch Cam account. Encourage you to check that out if you want to get a nice overview. And yeah, everybody's been great. Appreciate the good spirits. I hope you all have a safe end to 2020 and a brighter 2021 on the horizon for hopefully all of us, for birds, for Project FeederWatch. And yeah, looking forward to hopefully seeing those red polls. Emma, I'll get you offline and figure out where you saw those.
Okay.
Thanks everybody for coming. Take care.